Alexander pumped a laser blast through the skull of the alien boarding his ship, spraying green blood across the cockpit window. He didn't blink as brain matter splattered his face, instead checking the flashing warnings on every screen. Hull breach in the cargo bay, port nacelle leaking plasma, shields failing, weapons overheating. Typical Tuesday. Pushing the corpse slumped over the control panel aside, Alexander yanked the joystick hard, rolling the battered freighter to port just as a plasma torpedo streaked by, nearly clipping the wing. In the forward cameras, he glimpsed the flaring engines of the pursuing Klingon warbird, its hull covered in spikes and blades, to strike fear into prey. But Alexander wasn't easy prey. "Another damned oversized scrap heap flown by psychos who eat live worms," he growled, flipping switches to shunt power from the failing shields to the engines. His old boat shuddered as he pushed the reactor to the red line, rocketing toward the volcanic moon ahead. The Klingons weren't about to let a notorious human mercenary slip away, not when he carried stolen intel worth a moon's ransom. They wanted his head, just like the Romulans from that job smuggling banned plasma rifles into their space. And the Ferengi hit squad still fuming about those forged latinum bars. At this point, Alexander had a price on his head in half the systems in the quadrant, all part of the job. His job, the only thing that mattered to him now. Not the Navy he'd once served with distinction, not the family who'd turned their backs when he'd needed them most. Just the next contract, the next payload, the next narrow escape. This was his life. This was all he had left. A hard impact jolted Alexander against his restraints. The Klingons had his range now. Alarms blared as the weakened shields collapsed and shrapnel ripped through the hull. Shit! The moon was still 30 seconds away at full burn. He was a sitting duck. Alexander didn't pray. He'd seen too much to believe any gods were listening. But as the crippled freighter dove into the roiling clouds of the volcanic moon, hull groaning, he found himself hoping that somehow this old boat had one last miracle left in her. A loud bang shook the ship as the port wing clipped an outcropping, sending the vessel into a wild spin. Thick, black smoke poured from the fractured nacelle, obscuring Alexander's view as he fought to level out. The planet's gravity pulled at the wounded craft like a predator, dragging prey into its jaws. Hull integrity at 20%, reactor containment failing. The ship's computer blared dire warnings. Alexander ignored the flashing alerts, his eyes locked on his sensor screen. There! A faint signal through the interference, Knox's ship diving after him, disruptors glowing as they prepared to finish him off. He bared his teeth in a feral grin. "Not yet, you scaly bitch." He slapped the emergency power override, diverting everything to the maneuvering thrusters. The ship bucked like a wild bronco as he wrenched the yoke, trying to pull out of the dive. Metal shrieked in protest, rivets popping like gunshots. A stutter of disruptor fire stitched a line of molten holes along the freighter's flank. The acrid stench of burning circuits flooded the cockpit. Alexander choked on the fumes, eyes watering. Knox's warship knifed out of the swirling clouds, afterburners flaring. She bore down on him, weapons stabbing out to surgically cripple his ship. The freighter lurched and staggered as the starboard thrusters sputtered out under the onslaught. In the forward view screen, Alexander glimpsed Knox's fierce grin as she savored her impending kill. His jaw clenched as he pounded a fist on the sparking control panel in frustration. Shields gone, weapons offline, engines failing. He was a sitting duck. Suddenly, inspiration struck like a lightning bolt. One desperate gamble. Alexander's fingers flew over the controls, emergency rerouting power to the forward deflector. It was a suicide move, but what choice did he have? Jaw set, he angled the freighter's nose down, plunging deeper into the gas giant's churning storm bands. Visibility dropped to 0 as searing clouds swallowed the ship. Lightning danced across the hull, the stink of ozone mixing with scorched insulation. Knox doggedly pursued, her sensors faltering in the electromagnetic maelstrom. She narrowed her yellow eyes, fingers clenching around the weapons triggers as she fought to reacquire a target lock. The electromagnetic soup swallowed all sensor readings. Flying blind, Alexander gritted his teeth as he redlined the straining engines, pushing the battered ship to its limits. Suddenly, he cut power to the engines. The freighter spun end over end as he reversed thrust, bringing his nose to bear on Nox's warship. Nox's eyes flew wide as her prey suddenly whirled to face her. Startled, she reflexively fired, but the ion storm sent her shots wild, streaking harmlessly past Alexander's freighter. Alexander's lips peeled back in a wolfish grin. Teeth bared, he stabbed down on the deflector controls. A blinding flare erupted from the freighter's bow, the overcharged emitters unleashing a massive shockwave into the roiling clouds. The wall of force slammed into Nox's ship like a hammer blow. Bulkheads buckled, control panels exploded in showers of sparks. The warship tumbled away, trailing smoke and debris as the localized blast shattered its stabilizers. Shrieking warnings filled Nox's cockpit as the crippled ship plunged deeper into the planet's well of gravity. Consoles burst into flames around her as she fought to regain control, the planet's crushing pressure already distorting the hull. Gasping curses, she wrenched futilely at the controls, refusing to accept defeat even as the swirling storm swallowed her ship whole. Nox's ship careened through the churning clouds, a mortally wounded beast plunging toward its grave. Sparks burst from shattered consoles as the hull groaned under the planet's crushing grip. Nox hammered the emergency beacon, her distress call lancing out into the void, a desperate plea for salvation. In his own crippled vessel, Alexander watched his power levels plummet, the angry crimson of warning lights painting his face. He had minutes, maybe less, before his ship was swallowed by the maelstrom. His eyes flicked to the nav screen, plotting a course to punch through the atmosphere to the rendezvous coordinates. The success of the mission, his payment, his survival, all hung in the balance. His fingers danced over the controls, diverting the last dregs of power to the thrusters. The ship shuddered as the engines coughed to life, straining to lift him from the abyss. But even as he prepared to flee, his gaze slid to the bioscanner, to Nox's faltering life signs. The Klingon's heartbeat stuttered, brainwaves spiking erratically as the planet's fury crushed the life from her. Alexander's hand hovered over the throttle, an old familiar coldness settling over him. The pragmatism that had kept him alive, that had made him the best in the business. Leave the Klingon to her fate, complete the mission, survive. But as he watched Nox's vital signs gutter like a dying candle, something stirred in Alexander, something he'd thought long dead. A flicker of, what? Pity? Kinship? He didn't have a name for it, but it stayed his hand. God damn it, he snarled, wrenching the yoke. His ship banked hard, diving after Nox, a suicidal plunge into the heart of the storm. Lightning danced across his hull as the winds tossed him like a child's toy, the ship screaming as he pushed it to the breaking point. Through a haze of static, he glimpsed Nox's ship, a dark shape tumbling through the clouds. Gritting his teeth, he maneuvered alongside her, the two craft spinning in a deadly embrace. With a clang that reverberated through his bones, the docking clamps engaged, locking them together. Nox's eyes fluttered open, disbelief and something almost like respect flickering across her features as she saw Alexander's ship latch to her own. There was no time for words. Diverting everything to the straining engines, Alexander heaved back on the controls, forcing the joined ships into a brutal climb. The hull shrieked as the structural members warped, the planet's gravity clawing at them like a vengeful god. Coolant spewed from ruptured lines, alarms blaring, the ship coming apart around him. But still he climbed, pouring everything he had into one last desperate push, and with a bone-jarring wrench they broke free, the yawning maw of the gas giant spitting them out into the star-flecked void. The two ships, locked in a graceless tangle, spun lazily as they drifted in the silence of space. Vented atmosphere and debris trailed behind them, a glittering wake against the infinite black. In the cockpit, Alexander slumped back in his seat, his breath coming in ragged gasps, hands trembling as he released the controls. The airlock hissed open, the sudden rush of escaping atmosphere ruffling Alexander's sweat-soaked hair. He drifted forward, the weightlessness of the ruined ships allowing him to move with unnatural grace. Debris floated past, shattered panels, ruptured conduits, globules of coolant shimmering in the dim emergency lighting. Nox emerged from the opposite side of the airlock, her yellow eyes glinting in the gloom. Her black hair, usually pulled back in a severe warrior's knot, floated free, framing her angular face. Dark blood from a gash on her forehead drifted in crimson spheres around her. She glared at Alexander, her gaze fierce despite her battered state. They hung there, face to face, surrounded by the ruin they had wrought. Alexander's hand rested on the hilt of his plasma blade, his grip steady. Nox's fingers twitched towards her own dagger, belted at her hip. The silence stretched, taut as a wire, broken only by the hiss of leaking air and the fitful crackle of damaged systems. The ships groaned around them, a low metallic keening that set teeth on edge. Nox broke the impasse, her voice rough as gravel. "Why did you save me, human? You could have left me to die." Her tone carried an undercurrent of accusation, as if his actions were a slight against her honor. Alexander met her gaze unflinching, his jaw clenched, the muscles working under his stubble-shadowed skin. "Don't read too much into it," he replied curtly. "I need information, and you're more valuable to me alive than dead." His words were clipped, matter-of-fact, devoid of sentiment. Nox bristled, her fingers closing around the hilt of her dagger. "I am a warrior of the Klingon Empire," she snarled, pride and fury warring in her voice. "I will never betray my people, no matter what you do to me." Her eyes flashed defiance, daring him to challenge her. Alexander snorted, a harsh, derisive sound in the close confines of the airlock. "I don't need your secrets," he said, lip curling. "I need your help." He gestured to the devastation surrounding them, the twisted metal and sparking wires. "Both our ships are badly damaged. We're stranded out here, light years from any inhabited system. If we don't work together, we'll both die." His voice was flat, pragmatic, the voice of a man stating simple facts. Nox eyed him warily, suspicion etched in every line of her face. She was torn, caught between her ingrained distrust of humans and the undeniable logic of his words. The ships shuddered around them, underlining the precariousness of their situation. Grudgingly she nodded, the movement tight and controlled. "What do you propose?" The words sounded as if they were dragged from her throat, each syllable a concession. "A temporary truce," Alexander replied, his expression unreadable. "We pool our resources, repair what we can, and limp to the nearest neutral port. Once there, we go our separate ways and never speak of this again." His voice was cold, businesslike, a man proposing a transaction rather than a partnership. Nox hesitated, pride warring with pragmatism behind her eyes. Her grip tightened on her dagger, knuckles white against the dark metal. Then, slowly, she extended her hand, bridging the gap between them. "Agreed," she said, the word sounding like it was wrenched from her core. "But if you betray me, human, I will hunt you to the ends of the galaxy." Her voice was low, deadly serious, a promise rather than a threat. Alexander reached out, clasping her forearm in a warrior's grip. Their eyes met, a hint of grudging respect glinting in the depths. "Likewise, Klingon," he said, the ghost of a smile tugging at his lips. "Now, let's get to work." Hand still on his plasma blade, he pushed off towards the heart of the ship, Nox following close behind. In the days that followed, Alexander and Nox worked side by side, repairing the extensive damage to their ships. They salvaged what they could from Nox's vessel, cannibalizing it for parts to restore basic functionality to Alexander's. It was grueling work, hours spent in cramped Jeffries tubes and scorched engine rooms, the acrid stench of burnt circuitry and spilled coolant hanging in the air. They spoke little as they labored, communicating in terse sentences and pointed gestures, but even in their silences, a grudging respect grew. Alexander couldn't help but admire Nox's fierce determination, the way she never complained, never slacked, even when exhaustion dragged at her limbs. And Nox, watching Alexander jury-rig a power coupling with nothing but scrap metal and sheer stubbornness, began to understand how he'd earned his reputation as a survivor. As the days bled into weeks, their rations dwindling, they fell into a tense routine. They traded insults and challenges as they worked, each trying to outdo the other. But at night, huddled over a meager meal of protein bars and recycled water, their conversation took a different turn. "Why do you do it?" Knox asked one evening, her eyes glinting in the dim light of the galley. "Why risk your life for credits and cargo?" Alexander was silent for a long moment, staring into the depths of his battered metal mug. When he finally spoke, his voice was distant, haunted. "I used to believe in something," he said. "The Federation, my crew, my family. But they all let me down in the end. Now all I have left is the job. It's the only thing that hasn't betrayed me." Knox nodded slowly, understanding flickering in her gaze. "For me it is duty," she said. "Honor. My life belongs to the Empire, to my house. Every battle, every scar is a testament to my loyalty." She traced a finger along a jagged ridge of scar tissue on her forearm, a faraway look in her eyes. In that moment, a spark of understanding passed between them, an acknowledgement of the pain they both carried, buried deep. They were warriors, survivors, bound by a code that few could comprehend, and in that shared knowledge, a fragile bond began to form. Weeks turned to months as they fought to bring the ship back to life. They worked in grim silence, each setback a personal affront, each small victory hard won. But slowly, painstakingly, they began to make progress. The day they finally restored power to the engines, the ship humming to life around them, they allowed themselves a moment of triumph. Alexander let out a whoop of joy, a rare, unguarded grin splitting his face. Even Knox couldn't suppress a fierce smile, her eyes alight with satisfaction. But as they prepared to depart, plotting a course for the nearest neutral port, an unexpected tension filled the air. Alexander, his hand hovering over the navigation controls, turned to Knox, an uncharacteristic hesitation in his eyes. "Come with me," he said, his voice gruff, almost uncertain. "Leave the Empire behind. We make a good team, you and I. Think of what we could accomplish together." Knox stared at him, stunned, a sudden traitorous longing rising in her chest. For a moment she allowed herself to imagine it, a life unbound by duty, by the constant drumbeat of war, a life where she could choose her own path, forge her own destiny. But even as the thought formed, she pushed it away, a pang of sorrow lancing through her. She shook her head, her voice thick with emotion. "I cannot. My place is with my people, my honor. I am a Klingon, and always will be." Alexander nodded, his expression hardening, a shutter falling over his eyes. "I understand, but if you ever change your mind, you know how to find me." He turned back to the controls, his shoulders rigid, his jaw clenched. Knox watched him, a sudden unwelcome wetness stinging her eyes. Angrily she blinked it away, cursing the weakness of sentiment. She knew with a leaden certainty that the next time they met, it would be as enemies, their brief alliance forgotten in the heat of battle. And yet, as Alexander's ship pulled away, the airlock sealing with a hiss of finality, she couldn't help but wonder what might have been, had she been brave enough to choose a different path. With a heavy heart, she turned back to her own vessel, preparing for the long, lonely journey back to Kronos, the weight of her choices bearing down on her like the crushing depths of space. You have reached the end of the story. If you enjoyed this story and want to support us, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel, and for every comment that says 88, I will heart every single one of them. Thank you for your time.